Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 224. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author David Weill about his new book, All That Really Matters. In this novel, the main character, Dr. Joe Bosco, is a rising star in the heart transplant field, and he's feeling all the pressures that come with the job. His professional and personal issues lead him into trouble, and this novel explores how he gets himself out of such trouble and finds redemption. David Weill knows all about being a transplant surgeon, and he wrote All That Really Matters to give readers an idea of what kind of people work in the field and what it feels like to do that job. While the book is a work of fiction, it incorporates a mixture of real-world personalities and situations in an effort to humanize doctors and explore the high-stakes world of medical transplants. In this episode, I'll chat with David about his writing journey, what surprised him about the way in which books become books, and the lesson he wants everyone to take away from his novel, that redemption is always available to us, as well as a few other things. Coming up. David Weill, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for having me.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, All That Really Matters. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
All That Really Matters is the story of a heart transplant surgeon who's my protagonist, who has some issues. He has a steep rise in his career, has a lot of high expectations put on him, and then he gets himself into a bit of trouble. And the back half of the book really is a description of how he gets out of trouble and how he finds real purpose in his life. Thus the title, All That Really Matters. That's what he's looking for.
And what was that spark for you, that thing that made you go, okay, there's a story idea here?
It really came out of my work in the hospital setting. I ran the transplant program at Stanford for many years, and I saw a lot of rich personalities, and my protagonist really was an amalgamation of some of the folks that I worked with even. And I think that doing that kind of work, has high highs and low lows, and it puts a lot of stress on the people that work in our field. But it also, occurred to me that the field itself attracts a certain kind of personality, and I wanted to expose the reader to what kind of people do this work, where you have life and death in the balance each day, and you're carrying around a waiting list of people's names that need a transplant that can happen at any time. And I wanted to give the reader an idea about what's that like, what it feels like. Not so much the mechanics of doing a transplant, that might not be too interesting to people, but what it feels like to do the job.
Let's talk about your main character, Dr. Joe Bosco, in a little more depth. Let's talk about particularly his job. What drove him to this? How did he find himself here?
So Joe was the only child actually, of a mother who was a book editor and whose dad was a Nobel Prize laureate, a physician as well, and a neuroscientist. And they had very high expectations for him, and a lot of pressure was put on him. And while he fulfilled those expectations for really much of his life, and he was that kind of golden child. He began to read his own press, if you will. And I think a lot of the work that he did, as it does in real life, kind of goes to your head, and he was a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and so he kind of got a real charge out of saving people's lives, out of being told that he was wonderful all his life. And of course, that kind of hubris gets you into trouble sometimes, both in novels and in real life. And I wanted to describe his journey from, a steep rise, having a decline, and then figuring out a way for him to get out of it.
You mentioned that he was sort of inspired by a number of different kinds of personalities that you had worked with in your own career. What did you find to be the most important aspects of his personality? What did you decide to shine the light on for this character?
The main thing that I wanted to get across about the character is, what happens to people that have sized expectations that are put on them by others, but also put on them by themselves. And then those expectations get fueled by all the gratitude that you receive, all the positive feedback you receive from doing good things, not bad things, from doing good things. And how, if not properly managed and kept in perspective, that can really lead to some trouble. And I wanted readers to understand that, when they're getting complex medical therapy of this sort, some of the people that are delivering those care, that kind of care, have issues of their own, naturally. They're not robots. They're real people with real feelings. And I wanted to show that in the novel.
Clearly, this is a high pressure situation. This character is under a lot of strain and stress from a number of different areas. And you mentioned professional career, his patients, his family, loved ones. Let's talk about how he dealt with that pressure and whether or not you thought he dealt with it well, or if not well, was it reasonable what he did to deal with that pressure?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I've thought a lot about this over the course of my own career. And in informing this character, I thought about what would be really true to life. And the true to life experience is we all deal with the stresses in our life, sometimes in very adaptive ways, good ways. We exercise to relieve stress. We have one glass of wine with our spouse. We have diversions, sports. We read a book. That's all good and well. What I think happens is sometimes, and I saw this in the transplant teams that I managed, is people were dealing with these stresses in maladaptive ways. So it wasn't one drink; it was 10. It was drug use. It was extramarital affairs. It was exercise to the point of obsession. There was no moderation in what folks did in their personal lives because their professional lives were totally absent of any moderation. It's a, fighter pilot type of mentality where your hair's on fire kind of all of the time. And I wanted to bring the reader into that environment and let him or her meet some of these characters. I've said this before, while the book is fiction, it's not science fiction. In other words, these are real people that I worked with, or combinations of real people that I worked with that responded to what we do professionally in a certain way. And you'll see in the book some of the characters actually are quite well adjusted, and some aren't. And that's true. In the real hospital setting as well. And you can probably see it in other industries. I'm sure you can, whether or not you're a Wall Street trader or you work in a high pressure law firm or you're a, you know, pilot, or just to use a few examples. So medicine's not the only place where these kind of stresses exist, but it was a world that I knew very well from having worked in it for so many years.
Are there life lessons to be learned from watching this character go from sort of this meteoric rise to this sudden crash and trying to find his way back to redemption. Do you think there are life lessons to be learned from that journey with the main character?
I hope so. I mean, that was the reason I wrote the book. I think that the lessons are a few. I think one, right size your expectations of what life can provide. I think that's a big one. That's a big one for all of us. It's been a big one for me too. I expect things to go well. I've been fortunate enough they often have. But at the same time, when they don't go well, I have to understand that they don't always go well. There's that. There's the other one of not, you know, taking to heart so much what other people tell you. I mean, I've been lucky enough to hear patients' gratitude toward me. And, I remind myself often to be humbled by it rather than empowered by it. And so that can be a struggle also. But the final lesson I think might be the most important that I wanted readers to take away is redemption. I think what's one great thing about this life is for many of the mistakes that we make, and I would say the vast majority of the mistakes we make, redemption is always available to us. We can turn things around. We can improve. We can grow. We can evolve. And I wanted to show this character moving from one spot and by the end of the novel being a much better spot. And I hope that, there's a reader out there that may be going through their own struggles that'll say, look, maybe it's available to me also to redeem myself, to be in a better place. It's going to take hard work, but maybe I can do it too.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you learn anything about yourself, about this world by writing this book? I mean, I know you've lived it for so long, but then having to spend that much time in someone else's shoes, in someone else's head while doing it, did you discover anything yourself?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And the things that I learned most were the reactions of the people around this character. I knew the character well because again, I had worked with folks like this. What I guess I needed to understand better as I wrote the novel is what about all the other people that this guy interacted with? What about his girlfriend? What about his head nurse? What about his physician colleagues? What about his parents? What about his next door neighbor? I think what's interesting about people like this is the impact they have on the people around them. In other words, it's one thing if he's struggling and he's kind of losing his perspective, but it's another thing to really show the impact that that has on the people around you. And so anybody that's been through struggles know that, the vast majority of the time you don't do it by yourself, right? I mean, when you go through something, when I go through something, it has an impact on the people around us. And that's what I learned the most about writing this book, I think, is to really delve into how somebody like this impacts the rest of the people in their world. And that took probably the most thought of the entire novel.
Interesting. What was the reaction from family and friends when reading this? Did they feel that it rang true? Did they see themselves in any particular aspect of it? Did you get any surprise comments from them?
Yeah, the reactions have been, wonderful. I mean, wonderful to hear just because I think for the people that, have worked in a hospital, they're nodding their head as they're reading the book. They're going, yeah, I know. And I think that they can appreciate the characters because they know the characters just like I know them.
Yeah.
And I think for the non-medical people, at times I've been asked, well, it can't be like this, right? And I'm like, it's exactly like this. And I think that that's been interesting because then they go back and they're like, oh, okay. And perhaps they look at their doctor differently. Perhaps when they get health care, they think of that experience differently. I don't know. But I think the most interesting part has been the non-medical people who have read it because they really probably don't have a real clear idea about what the physician across from them is going through. And I hope I can at least shed some light on that. I tried to.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to ask you, what have you found that people do not know about this world, either about physicians and surgeons themselves or transplants or whatever? Have you been surprised by the things people didn't know about it?
Yeah, I mean the biggest sort of category of I think misperceptions from the lay public about people in healthcare, whether it's physicians, nurses, whoever, is that we're humans. You know, I think we do a pretty good job of hiding that from our patients. You know, you come into an exam room and, you know, you have an appointment with your doctor and he or she kind of comes charging in and they start firing off questions and it doesn't look like they care that much sometimes. And they kind of seem like robots sometimes. And I've been guilty of that too, I'm quite sure. But I think what I do in my writing, this would be my first book and my second book in this novel, is try to humanize doctors because I found doctors, some of them brilliant, many of them flawed, and you know they had great positives and big negatives, you know, about their personalities. And I found that range of personalities really interesting when I was working in the hospital. And I think that that can surprise a reader who, for instance, might think that when we lose a patient, when something doesn't go well, we just kind of shake it off and we move on to the next one. That's not how it happens. That I didn't see a lot of shaking it off. I mean, I think every time that happens to a doctor, they lose a little bit of themselves. And I wanted to humanize the people that do this kind of work.
And you mentioned like this is your first novel.
Yes.
Is it something you always wanted to do? Writing books, writing fiction? I mean, was that something that's always been with you, or is that something you've discovered later in life as a result of having this idea?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of writing throughout my whole life, but a lot of it was professional writing,
Mm.
for work. I wrote, a lot of articles for medical journals, and none of which your listeners would want to read. I got really interested toward the second half of my career, and while I was at Stanford, started taking writing courses at night, just because I thought, based on the things that I was seeing, humans at their best and their worst, both patients and the healthcare providers, that there was a story to tell. I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to tell it. So my first book was a memoir about my experience running the transplant program at Stanford, the ups and downs, the emotional roller coaster, patients, what I learned from the patients as they were facing, life and death. But after that book was published and I really enjoyed the process of writing it, I was trying to decide what to write next. And I thought that I had told most of the story in my first book. I didn't think I told all of it. And there's a lot of reasons that happens, of course, as you know, in nonfiction, there's sensitivities of various sorts, patient confidentiality. You don't necessarily want to call out the institution where you worked for certain things. And I felt like the novel gave me more latitude to really explore all of what's going on in healthcare generally without having to worry about who I was offending.
Mm. Well, and now that you've had a taste for it, do you think there will be more books like this in the future?
I do. I'm
Okay.
working actually on a third book that's going to be back to nonfiction, but I'm reasonably sure my fourth one, God willing, um, will be back to fiction.
Okay.
I think I'm gonna I think I'm gonna end up writing both again for as long as I can do this. I think I'm gonna end up writing both.
Do you prefer one over the other? Is one more a more natural fit for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, one that goes through my mind a lot. I think. I think I had more fun, to be honest with you, writing the novel than I did the memoir. The memoir was sort of excruciating in a lot of ways. It
Mm,
was cathartic, and I was getting a lot off of my chest, and it was a very emotional book to write. This one had emotion in it too, of course, but it was fictionalized, and I had fun. Like I was actually having fun writing it. I'm back to nonfiction. I'm kind of, knee deep in the book I'm writing right now. And I remember, the emotional kind of part of writing very personal stories. And I, 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 I'm, I'm quite sure that I'll write another novel. Whether or not it'll be exclusively that the rest of the way, I don't know. But I'm going to go back to fiction writing. I really enjoy it.
yeah. And now that you've been writing, you mentioned you're writing your third book. Is there anything from your career, your non-writing life, that you've brought to bear on your writing? And then I'm curious if the reverse has happened also. Anything that you've learned in writing that you then sort of incorporate into how you approach things, how you think about things, or how you attack things in in the rest of your work.
Yeah, I'm not the first writer to say that, I write to increase my own understanding, and I do think it has done that for me. It's helped me understand my relationship to my field. I've worked on being a transplant doctor for 25 or 30 years. I mean, it was a big part of my life. It was my identity, actually, for many years, for better or for worse. So I think that the writing has helped me understand my relationship with that field. It wasn't just a job for me. It was much more than that. It was closer to religion than a job. So I do think the writing has informed that. I also think that in doing the kind of work I do now, I don't work in the hospital anymore. I do healthcare related consulting, but I help teams work together better and I help transplant programs perform better. I think that I notice a lot more because I've written.
Mm.
I'm always reluctant to say I'm a writer, but I guess I am at this point. But I think that as a writer, my observation skills have become more acute. They're better than they were. And I think that that's a key step in becoming a writer. You really have to be a good observer of what people are doing. So I go to a cocktail party now or a dinner party and I'm, kind of examining everybody there in my own head, and trying to think of them in the richness of their character, quote unquote.
Right, right.
I don't know if that's a good thing, but that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, well, it certainly can keep you busy, right? What's that
Yep.
person's story? And just trying to describe what somebody's wearing or what somebody's feeling or thinking or the atmosphere or whatever. It can occupy your mind full
Yeah.
time if
I
you let
think
it.
that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And sometimes that's a nuisance, but most of the time it's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. Has anything surprised you about writing, this writing journey of yours? Any, because you started with a memoir, which is a very hard thing to do. Most of the people I've talked to who have written memoirs, it is not for the faint of heart. It is a brutal exercise, like you mentioned. So you started with that, and then you worked to nonfiction where you found you had fun. Now you're back to or fiction and then nonfiction. Has anything surprised you on this journey, either about how you write, the actual act of writing, or the experience of it, or the reaction of people to it? Any surprises?
I think the writing itself, I have not been surprised about because I knew it was really hard to do. Even writing articles for medical journals is hard to do. So I was not surprised at how hard it is, and it is hard. What I guess I didn't know as much about, and I'm a little surprised at it, is the publishing industry. It's every time I think healthcare industry has issues, I look at the publishing industry, um, and you know, it's it, it's interesting to me. Aside from the writing, how books become books. How do they get on the bookshelf? And that part has surprised me. There doesn't seem as much order to it and rhyme and reason. And books that do well or don't do well also don't seem to have a real order to it or a pattern. And so I think that's been the surprising part. But in terms of actually getting the words down on the page, which is, I think, as a writer, I should focus almost exclusively on, I think it's not that surprising at how difficult it is to craft a story. It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you tend to be disciplined about your writing, dedicated time or scheduled time, or do you tend to just find time to write whenever those few moments happen? I mean, what is your approach to it?
I pretty much split my day in half, and I've done this for now, since, geez, I mean, half dozen years, I guess, where I write in the morning and then have lunch, and then in the afternoon do my consulting work. I kind of split my day right down the middle. I don't find that when I'm writing, quote unquote, I'm always writing. I
Yeah.
find myself scribbling and thinking and, strategizing about the book, a lot of that time. And I'm almost like this book I'm working on, I'm really finished, quote unquote, writing the book in my head, but I haven't written all of it yet. And I think there's always the advice that I've heard authors give where you just got to sit down and you just got to write and write and write and write. I don't think I necessarily subscribe to that. I think it requires a lot of thinking about how the book will go rather than the actual typing part. So I tend to spend a lot of the day, even after I've done my consulting work, I'm at night sitting by myself thinking about how the book is going in my head, how it's going to end up, how I'm going to land the plane, if you will,
Right, right.
you know.
So do you tend to, because I'm always curious about writers' approach. Some people just throw words down on the page, however they come, and create a book sort of by the Dr. Frankenstein model. They sort of,
Right.
patch it together and move things
Yeah.
around and stitch it up when
Right.
they've
Right.
got enough. And others plot very seriously and then just write to their outline. And still others pants the whole thing. And
Right.
it's a so every day is a surprise, every sentence is a surprise. And then there are people that are kind of in between. It sounds like yours is maybe a fair bit of it in your head first before getting it on the page, even.
Yeah, it really is. I think I can't undo what I did for, 25 years. I mean, as a transplant doctor, I mean, my job was to look around the corner. I mean, I didn't have the luxury of, just thinking about what's happening right now, with patients, especially ones that are very sick. You kind of have to think of step one through 10, and you have to really plan ahead and think ahead. And, in your personal life, it drives my wife crazy because I'm, thinking about the seven or eighth step. I think that the same thing is true with my writing. I'm thinking about all the steps that are in place that I need to get to before I even sit down to write. And I think it's the transplant doctor in me. I don't think I
Mm.
can knock that out. I doubt very seriously that I'm going to get to the point where I just sit down and I'm like, well, I don't know what's coming, and I'm just going to start typing. I kind of doubt that. It's probably not in my DNA to do
Yeah.
that.
Do you find you spend a lot of time on the editing process once your draft is done? Does your draft require a lot of editing, a number of different machinations, or is it fairly tight? Do you kind of edit as you go?
It's not, I hate to say this because it's going to sound egomaniacal, and I don't mean it this way. It's actually not that bad when it comes out. I mean, I
Yeah.
know a lot of people talk about their bonnet drafts and how bad they are and all that kind of stuff. It's actually not that bad. I mean, it's not perfect either, but it's not that bad when it comes out. So I don't go back and fix a lot of it. I fix some of it because, I haven't, I realize I haven't had a paragraph in 3 pages, or I haven't had, I've misspelled thousands of words or something like that. But a lot of it is fairly usable. I don't tend to write a bunch of stuff that is never going to make it, and so it comes out in pretty decent form. of course, since I started writing a number of years ago, I've been working with an editor who's, fantastic. Her name is Clara Wachtel, and, she's helped me tremendously. And when I give her pages and, they're in at least semi-decent shape, she really helps me with her questions, really express what I'm trying to express much better.
Yeah, it sounds like you take more of a like a strategist approach to writing, more strategic planning.
Yeah, I think so. I have this bulletin board, where I use, and I didn't obviously make this up either because I've heard other authors talk about it. I just have a bulletin board with 3x5 index cards, and they have scenes
Mm-hmm.
on them, and they're all on a bulletin board, and I move them around and do all sorts of things with them. And that's how my books actually get formed is I put all the scenes on a bulletin board and then take a card down and say, well, today I'm writing about my time at a dinner party, um, or Joe Bosco's surgery or something, and that's kind of how I organize them.
Yeah. What has been the best part of this writing journey for you?
I guess I have a little bit of gratitude junkie in me too. I like it when people respond to the reading. I mean, I was with somebody last night that read the book and told me they liked it a lot. And they read it in two sittings and things that I'm sure a lot of authors hear. I like that. I like it quite a bit. I think it's nice when people respond to your work. I think even better than that, though, is when I reread something I write, and I do that. I write some op-eds as well for various places, and sometimes I go back and reread them, and I like it when I like it. Like when I
Mm-hmm.
say, "Well, I said that pretty well." That's a nice part of it. It really is. I mean, I've always thought about, would I write if no one read it?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the answer to that. Maybe I would do it anyway, but it sure is nice when somebody tells you they responded to your work.
Right, right. Well, so let's see if we can get more people responding. Where can people go if they want to find more information about you, the book, new things that you have coming up, that sort of thing?
I think the easiest place to look for all of it really is at my website. It's just my name, David Weill, Weill.com. There's links to buy the book. There's videos that I've done, interviews, op-eds that I've written, all kinds of things about what I'm up to. It might be the easiest place to find out.
Okay. Well, and if people do want to buy the book, other than going to your website, suggestions on where it's available.
Yeah, it's available in a lot of independent bookstores across the country, and I always want to make a plug for them. There's a one in New Orleans that actually has a huge supply of signed copies called Octavia Books. They have a website that you can order from, and they'll send it right over to you. Just like any author has to be these days. All the big booksellers online. I'm definitely there, and I tell everybody if you could leave a review of the book, that would be nice too.
Right, right. Yes, please. Good. Okay. Well, David, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with all that really matters and the current book in the works. We'll look forward to that as well. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you, Stacy, and thanks for having me and your thoughtful questions. They were very
Thanks.
good.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the bookshop at the end of the internet.